Hello everyone, my name is Mike and we're back again with part 2 of OverSimplified's Cold War video. We're picking up right where we left off, actually minutes after. The way that we left off was it mentioned about JFK's presidency. The kind of Checkpoint Charlie would be the high point of his presidency, but obviously we know what's about to happen with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I imagine his assassination will be mentioned in this. So without further ado, let's get back into this. As usual, if there's any recommendations to other videos or any other tips or positive feedback that you'd like to mention to me or ways to improve the channel, then please let me know. But without further ado, let's get into this.
The link below and get your first 2 months for free. For anyone who thinks recent US history has never been as crazy as it is right now, allow me to present to you the 1960s, extreme cultural division, major political assassinations, and the closest the world has ever come to nuclear apocalypse. Shocked by the CIA's intrusive methods for putting down socialism in Latin America, a certain Fidel Castro met with a certain Che Guevara in a bar in Mexico City, and the two of them decided they should grow some awesome beards and overthrow the Cuban government, which is exactly what they did. Cuba had been America's summer playground, and America didn't like seeing a communist regime being set up in its own backyard. So the US immediately began training up Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. However, as the day of the operation came closer, Kennedy wanted to conceal any US involvement in the plan. So he massively scaled back American air support, and as a result, the Bay of Pigs invasion was a humiliating defeat for America. But Castro felt there was still an impending US threat to his regime. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had a lot of medium-range nuclear missiles that couldn't reach America, but they could if they were positioned, say, on an exotic Caribbean island off the coast of Florida. Hey, I'm a communist who hates America. You're a communist who hates America. You know what that means? We should fall in love. I was just going to suggest you set your missiles up in Cuba. Oh, no, you're right. That's a better idea. Be still, my beating heart. On October 4th...
Okay, yeah, so we're getting straight into the Cuban Missile Crisis. And again, as it suggested, the Americans were training up operatives to essentially go in and overthrow the Cuban government, the Cuban communist government. But obviously, due to not wanting to seem apparent by it on the global stage, obviously they rolled back the air support for it, and this meant that the Bay of Pigs invasion was a colossal disaster. It was utterly defeated, and again, this would kind of lead to Fidel Castro's hatred of America just hardening. Fidel Castro as well, I don't know how much this video is going to get into him, but as well, I think, it's a famous thing that the amount of assassination attempts that he managed to survive, that the Americans tried to kill him with all manner of things, from bombs to explosive cigars to getting one of his ex-lovers to go in to assassinate him, only she not only told him about the plan, but she then joined him and stuff like that. So certainly an interesting individual. However, as well, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara as well, by no means necessarily the nicest people either. So they certainly have their own checkered history, as does everyone. But yeah, we're getting straight into the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there's a funny story of how the Cuban missiles were kind of found in America, or the intelligence leading up to that. But we'll let the video flow first, and then if they don't mention it, then we'll mention it afterwards.
1962, a U-2 spy plane over Cuba noticed something strange. Sir, you need to look at this photograph. You're right. That's the cutest dog I've ever seen. Sir, I was referring more to the Soviet missiles. America freaked out as they realized what was going on. They were completely vulnerable, and they had to act fast. They knew that airstrikes or an invasion of Cuba would likely mean nuclear war with the Soviet Union. So Kennedy came up with another idea, a blockade. The US Navy announced it would stop and search any Soviet ships heading to Cuba, and would sink any that did not comply. In response, the Soviet put its military into full combat readiness. The US did the same, and began drawing up plans for an attack on Cuba. Things were escalating fast, and both superpowers were getting ready for World War III. Emergency communications between the two sides broke down as Khrushchev rejected Kennedy's demands for the missiles to be removed, and for the first time in history, US Strategic Air Command moved to DEFCON 2.
Okay, so just quickly there. Yeah, the U-2 spy plane spotted the missiles, but there's also a string of unfortunate events, I suppose, if you're looking at it from the communist side. that led to this, and this was the U-2 spy plane not only spotted missiles, but particularly some of the things that they were kind of informed on by I think the French kind of liaison to the CIA, was particularly the packages that they found, or the containers that the intelligence services were able to photograph and spot, were containers that were specifically used for Soviet missiles. So in order to remain stealthy, the Soviets didn't exactly do a great job, because they put them in the boxes only used for transporting missiles, which isn't great. There's also the evidence of things like SAM sites, which, for those of you who don't know, are surface-to-air missiles. Missiles built for counter-air, essentially. And you'd only really have SAM sites if you had something to protect them, or if you had SAM sites for protecting something, which leads to, again, more worrying images of potential nuclear or capability. And also the comedic one as well is as the U-2 spy plane that flew over, allegedly. The thing that also sold it and drew suspicions was the fact that there were football pitches in Cuba. And to quote one of the ministers, is that the Cubans play baseball and the Russians or the Soviets play soccer. And so the U-2 spy plane, allegedly, because they saw football pitches or soccer pitches to American watchers, drew suspicion because it wasn't baseball pitches or baseball. I don't actually know what you call baseball fields. Baseball fields? I don't know. But yeah, so sport almost gave the game away, as well as transporting. They might as well have transported the missiles in boxes that said "totally not missiles" for all the work they'd done. But yeah, America is moved to DEFCON 2. A blockade is lifted where America is essentially almost set up an exclusion zone around Cuba and says, you give us right to search your vessel for any material goods, otherwise we will sink you. And when the Russians or the Soviets don't comply, then that's another kind of increase in hostility.
DEFCON 1 means nuclear war. The Soviets shot down a U-2 spy plane over Cuba. A Soviet nuclear submarine in the Caribbean mistakenly believed war had already broken out, and 2 of the senior officers gave the go-ahead to fire its nuclear torpedo. Thankfully, the 3rd senior officer, this beautiful man, refused to authorize the decision. The US finalized its preparations, and I kid you not, the day before the US were set to decide the day and time for the Cuban invasion, Khrushchev was like, hey, you know, if you just removed your missiles from Turkey, we'd remove ours from Cuba? Yeah, that sounds good to me. It was a bit more complicated than that, but at the last second, the 2 sides finally came to an agreement. Soviet missiles were shipped out of Cuba, and the world breathed one gigantic sigh of relief, except for one guy, who was bloody livid. Phew! Let's hope that's the biggest crisis of my presidency. Unfortunately for him, his presidency was to end.
Okay, so while this advert's playing, no, there we go. Okay, so Turkey, America was also staging missiles in in Turkey, and that was the kind of way that it was shortened out and kind of smoothed out between the two nations. US agrees to move their nuclear arsenal, so to speak, out of Turkey, and the Soviet Union does the same with Cuba. Happy days for everyone. Okay. But another important thing to remember in the last video, as I said, with the Berlin airlift and things like that, is that nuclear submarine, which I knew prior to this video, with Vasily Ashkarabov. That's somebody who I feel like everybody should know, because that man almost single-handedly stopped World War III from happening. Because I believe the situation with the submarine is that there was interference or something malfunctioned that told the submarine that basically they'd been authorized to use nuclear weapons, or nuclear weapons had already been fired from America. And it was a technical glitch, which I suppose when you already have heightening tensions is possibly one of the worst times to have a technical glitch. And the fact that it needed all 3 submariner officers to basically go ahead with launching the nuclear weapons, the fact that 2 of them agreed and he was the only one that didn't, and therefore the nukes were not authorized, how close was we to nuclear Armageddon, nuclear apocalypse? I feel like, again, there's so many cases that it could have escalated to an extreme level, but it didn't, thankfully. Obviously it didn't escalate. But yeah, it's something that makes history so interesting, is how things could have changed. And we talk about the different flashpoints and stuff like that I have in the last video and stuff like this, but this almost certainly is an extremely one, because it essentially came down to somebody's gut decision of whether to authorize nuclear weapons. And there is no doubt that had those nuclear weapons been launched from that submarine, then under MAD, mutually assured destruction, America would have retaliated to the Soviet Union. Then Soviets would again launch their own nuclear weapons from their own nuclear arsenals to all various targets. I remember as well, it wouldn't just be Soviets versus Americans. There were nuclear weapons stored all over Western Europe, and there were nuclear weapons stored all over Eastern Europe. And so it wouldn't just be America versus the Soviet Union. It'd also be places like Europe getting hit, Eastern Europe getting hit. I mean, during the whole Cold War, there was many protests within my own country in England about people unhappy that the Americans were storing nuclear weapons in England, because it made us a target from the Soviet Union should something have happened. And I can only imagine there were similar thoughts or protests in other Western European countries. If you do know of those, please let me know. I don't actually know. I'm only speculating. And I imagine probably there would be some uncertainty and not particularly fond memories of those in the Eastern Europe as well, whose nations were hosted as nuclear weapons as well. But yeah, just how close we came to nuclear war, which, as Einstein, the famous Einstein quote said, don't know what World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. And more that we know about nuclear weapons, that seems to be an even more fitting and chilling quote. However, this is the assassination of JFK, of course, which again would have rippling effects throughout American society during the outmath of his presidency. Helps if I actually remember to put the sound back on after the advert.
Unfortunately for him, his presidency was to end with one. Having nearly blown up the planet, a few changes were made. First, the superpowers agreed to a limited test ban treaty. Secondly, the Soviets ousted Khrushchev and replaced him with Leonid Brezhnev, who was a kisser. He liked to kiss. Both sides were deeply concerned at the prospect of nuclear war, but still, the arms race raged on throughout the 60s and 70s. US intelligence worked out that the Soviets' nuclear arsenal was not as powerful as they previously thought, but in fact, it was America that held the advantage. ABMs and MIRVs were developed, and the doctrine of MAD. If both sides knew they would be completely destroyed by a nuclear war, neither would risk starting one. But even without war, the world was already feeling the effects of nuclear weapons. In 1966, above the pleasant town of Palomares in Spain, a US bomber collided with a tanker mid-air, and 4 hydrogen bombs fell and landed near the town below. It hasn't exploded, so I'm sure everything's fine. Whoa, boy. Hey, I wouldn't eat that if I were you. Okay. What were you gonna do today? Go for a swim? Yeah, I wouldn't. Are you breathing right now? Yeah? Yeah. I wouldn't. It took the Americans 2.5 months to find one of the bombs, which had gone missing in the ocean. This was the 14th time America had lost a nuclear bomb since 1950. Nobody knows how many bombs the Soviet Union lost. So sleep well tonight. After Kennedy's assassination, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took over, and he inherited a developing crisis in the East, Vietnam. Back in the 50s, the Vietnamese had kicked their French colonizers out once and for all, and the country was divided into two. In the north, a communist regime, and in the south, an anti-communist regime. Both were led by very sweet-looking old men, but don't let that deceive you. They were both ruthless dictators, and both dreamed of reuniting Vietnam under their own regime. So the north established the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, to carry out a campaign of guerrilla warfare in the south with Soviet support. The US sent advisors to help train the South Vietnamese to deal with the threat, but President Diem's brutal policies pushed more and more South Vietnamese to support the Viet Cong. And over the next decade, the situation escalated to a breaking point. America feared the domino effect. That is, if South Vietnam fell to communism, would Cambodia be next? Then Laos? Thailand? Burma? India? LBJ had to make a choice between losing South Vietnam or sending in the troops, and so in they went. From 1965, America found itself in a war unlike anything it had ever fought before. Let's play Spot the Viet Cong Soldier. Did you see him? Of course not. That's because millions of young American men were drafted and sent to fight a ruthless enemy who used the thick jungle as its shield. It was nearly impossible to tell where the enemy was, or worse, who it was. And as a result, the civilian population got caught up in the brutal crossfire. The city of Saigon found itself under regular attack, and America launched a bombing campaign in the north during Operation Rolling Thunder. The Viet Cong used the Ho Chi Minh Trail running through Laos and Cambodia to supply the campaign. It was a long and brutal war, and I could never do it justice in this video. But in terms of the Cold War, Vietnam was probably the biggest of many, many global conflicts that signaled a turning point.
Yeah, and so Vietnam, again, is a huge mess, essentially, for everyone involved. I mentioned in the previous video the domino effect, the concept of the Truman Doctrine, really, is the idea that if you allow one country to fall into communism, then the next country, that its neighbour, would fall to communism, and then that next neighbour would fall to communism, and so on and so forth, until you kind of have this ripple effect where communism is this unstoppable tide. And that's an argument, a major argument, why America committed so much resources to the fight against communism. And again, you know, it is similar things as the Australians as well. The Australians and Koreans also put significant amount of forces into Vietnam, not comparable to the United States, of course, but they certainly sent their own things there. And yeah, in a similar way to Korea, Ho Chi Minh was a waiter. That's the fun fact here. Ho Chi Minh was actually originally a waiter who worked in Paris, and eventually kind of led his way to leading basically the North Vietnamese, and they were ruthlessly efficient and effective in what they needed to do. You know, you obviously had the actual official North Vietnamese army, but then you had the VC, the Viet Cong, who would travel into the south, into the peasantry areas, conduct guerrilla raids, bomb Saigon, and for large parts of the war as well, the peasantry, the more rural areas, were essentially, despite them being in the south, were essentially under Viet Cong control, because the South Vietnamese government done, well, almost everything that they could to alienate people, particularly the peasantry, and this allowed kind of the VC free reign. But also the South Vietnamese army itself wasn't particularly well led or well organized, and the American advisors there as well also vastly underestimated the threat that they were facing. You know, the VC, or the North Vietnamese, depending on however you want to talk about it, had been fighting essentially since the Second World War. While the Japanese occupied things like Thailand and, you know, Indochina in that sense, you know, what would later become the NVA or the VC had been fighting a guerrilla campaign against the Japanese, and then later when the French, after the Second World War, tried to take back their colonies essentially, they had been fighting a guerrilla war there for years. And remember, this is against as well professional French troops itself, you know, paratroopers and stuff like that being caught off when they were trying to cut supply lines, and eventually the French actually had to, you know, pull out themselves and have some kind of amiable agreement with the NVA to essentially secure the passage of their own troops out there. And then the Americans turned up, and you remember this is a force that had been fighting the Imperial Japanese Army, who during the Second World War were formidable, who had been fighting the French for years as well for their own independence, and now the Americans have turned up, and the Americans, you know, it's been highly criticised, and I think some of that criticism is warranted, in that they thought that the NVA or the VC would be easily dealt with. due to manpower, due to technology and stuff like that, when in reality they severely underestimated the Vietnamese will and capability to fight on ground that they knew like the back of their hand. Things like using the Ho Chi Minh Trail to travel between different countries in Cambodia and Laos, avoiding the conflicts altogether. That's something that's entirely different and nobody really knew or anticipated. Apologies about that, I'm back. But yeah, so where were we? We were talking about Vietnam and the VC. And so the NVA and the VC's use of using the Ho Chi Minh Trail to not only bypass the technical border or front line, but also it was an extremely effective way of travelling with goods and supplies from the north to the guerrilla cells and units in the south. However, in the latter war and mid-war and latter war onwards, the Ho Chi Minh Trail would be the target to many kind of raids and bombing attempts to try and disrupt that supply chain. And so while the human cost began to increase on it, it still proved to be an extremely important and viable supply line. So not only did you have an enemy that knows its ground, an enemy that is well supplied, an enemy at this stage is also relatively battle hardened, fighting an American government who I think it is fair to say perhaps were overconfident in their own technology. I mean, helicopters and stuff like that proved to be vital in being able to move troops around to different places and area. But the important thing as well is it wasn't necessarily a conventional war. And by conventional war, I mean seizing settlements, seizing population centers, seizing strategic centers. The Americans waged the war in Vietnam as body count. They viewed success as turning up and, if they could kill a few thousand VC or NVA, then they'd consider that a success and then bug out. The problem with this is once that would happen, although the NVA would lose, a few thousand, they would simply just move into the area as soon as the Americans left. And this, leads up to a situation where America can't possibly win unless they actually fully militarily occupy the country, which is something that they weren't necessarily willing to do to the scale that it probably needed to be. Then you had things like the Hearts and Minds campaign, this idea to try and win over the civilian population in order to stop them from supporting or supplying or aiding the VC, or releasing intelligence on the Americans for them. But again, this came into direct contrast when you consider that the things that the South Vietnamese government were doing to its own citizens, that the American kind of cause of civilian casualties, particularly Operation Rolling Thunder, that was a huge task, and the amount of ordnance that was dropped on the north and northern population centres was huge. And you just need to think of the statistical evidence. Estimates of millions of Vietnamese civilian casualties have been caught up friendly fire on both sides, but a huge amount. I think estimates put it as several 100,000 civilians are said to have been killed in Operation Rolling Thunder, which was essentially the mass and indiscriminate bombing of the north. It's hard to say that Hearts and Minds were on your side, were doing this for your cause, or for your betterment, when at the same time you're bombing them. And similar to what I said at the end there, this would be the turning point, is of course the important thing with Vietnam as well is it was one of the first wars that was kind of televised and you could almost watch it from home. And I think for the American psyche as well, this was something that was quite apparent, because the First World War and the Second World War, America was involved in them. America lost thousands of people in the First World War. They lost thousands of people in the Second World War. I think that's why Pearl Harbor was damaging the Japanese effect on it, because it kind of shattered the illusion that war was something that America did, not was happening on American soil. And so I think in the original outbreak, that's why it was so devastating in the Second World War, even though Pearl Harbor itself as an operation wasn't actually that much of a Japanese success long term. But I think Vietnam as well is much in the same way, is that during the First and Second World War, if you exclude Pearl Harbor, while men were going to war and the casualties certainly happened, it was still viewed as something far away. War was something that didn't happen, in America. It was America was fighting elsewhere, and war wasn't necessarily there. Whereas I think, in contrast, European countries, obviously when you look at our history, centuries of warfare, and particularly with the First and Second World War, there wasn't a question of ignoring the war. The war was on people's doorsteps in London, England. You obviously had the Blitz, and the V2 rockets and stuff like that were doing damage to English cities. France was occupied. Spain and Germany obviously were major combatants in it. And so for Europeans, I suppose the idea of war necessarily wasn't something new. And I think, in a way, the opposal to things like Iraq and Afghanistan are comparable to Vietnam, because now we live in an era of peace where war isn't necessarily happening here. It's this kind of complex ideas. And I think for an American psyche, suddenly now that the war was being broadcast, it brought the war home to them, that these were American boots in Vietnam. Many of these boys didn't want to be there. Many of them were, coming home in coffins. And not only that, but the American public also saw what war is, and what, or rather how the Americans were waging war. And this led to, when it's hard to, again, see yourselves as the good guys necessarily in a material stage, when you also see the famous kind of photographs of the little girl running away from the village that's on fire, and her clothes have essentially burnt off the back of her back, and all things like this. And it began to turn public opinion away from the war, because suddenly not only were the Americans, who, in my personal opinion, necessarily getting the kind of their first proper taste of what conflict is, average day civilians I'm talking about, not servicemen or anything like that, but also, seeing themselves almost as, what are we doing here? Why are we here? Why are we doing this? And I feel like Vietnam was, in that sense, a turning point as well, away from the kind of McCarthyism type idea of communism is awful, we're on the right side of history, to more of a fractured society, between those who are vehemently anti-communist and those that are questioning maybe America's foreign policy and their attitude towards the Soviet Union in terms of military operations and violence. And again, this is, you can almost draw, first of all, I'm also apologise for rambling here, but you can also draw a direct comparison with Vietnam to the Malaysian crisis, in how they were handled. The Malaysian crisis was similar to Vietnam, obviously smaller in scale, but in Malaysia with communist uprisings, and attempted coups. And the Malaysian crisis, obviously Malaysia, British Empire type deal. The Malaysian crisis ultimately came to an end through a series of hearts and minds used by the British government, or the British military armed forces, and then surgical strikes on the Malaysian cells, until eventually the Malaysian crisis ended. Now, Vietnam was, again, they didn't go either. They didn't go full military occupation to the extent they needed to do. Hearts and minds didn't apply when you're also carrying out mass strategic bombing and indiscriminate bombing. And so Vietnam was kind of this catch-22 of everything that could possibly go wrong for America end up going wrong for America. And ultimately it led to Americans being forced to pull out into history as we know it today. But again, I've rambled for too much there. Let's go on to the rest of this video.
Under the threat of nuclear war, the two superpowers began working to make their relationship more constructive, and as a result, their ideological battle shifted away from the potential of direct conflict and more towards attempting to influence smaller proxy wars around the world. In the Middle East, the Soviet Union provided aid against Israel during the Six-Day War, and then again when the US backed Israel during the Yom Kippur War. In Africa, the Angolan Civil War saw US-supported South Africans fighting Soviet-supported Cubans. In the conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia, the superpowers interestingly switched sides as regimes changed, and the US continued fighting the spread of communism in its own backyard, funding the famous Contra groups to fight the socialist junta in Nicaragua. These proxy wars were fierce enough to begin with, but superpower intervention amplified the destruction and created alarming levels of human suffering throughout the Third World. And in Vietnam, that human suffering was all being broadcast back home via good old television. Going into the late 60s, America was a changing nation. This became this became this, and this became this. The new slogan that was taking root: make love, not war. The majority of Americans did not approve of Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War, and in 1968, a silent majority elected law and order candidate Richard Nixon. As the Vietnam War appeared to be increasingly unwinnable, and public opinion turning increasingly sour, Nixon made the decision to begin bringing the troops home, and ended US involvement in Vietnam by 1973. 2 years later, the South fell. The Cold War was now taking its toll on both superpowers. In Russia, a huge percentage of the budget was still going to the military. People were still hungry, and they just didn't have access to the same lifestyle and goods as the West. And what did they have to show for it? They weren't even winning the space race anymore. Both sides needed to reduce spending in order to rescue their economies, and so both welcomed with open arms an easing of hostilities, otherwise known as detente. To improve relations, Nixon became the first US president to visit Moscow in 1972, and Brezhnev returned the gesture a year later. A number of treaties were signed, including the 1972 SALT Agreement that limited nuclear weapons. Relations with China were even improving via ping-pong diplomacy when the US table tennis team went on a tour of the People's Republic. However, internally, China was still pushing anti-capitalist propaganda, which led to some mixed messages. Nixon even visited China in 1972, and it was a barrel of laughs.
Today, the president walks among priceless treasures from China's golden age. Among them, a pair of ear stoppers used by the emperor to keep from hearing criticism.
You put the stopper into his ears so that he couldn't hear the criticism.
Give me a pair of these.
他是不是给我一对啊？
Everything was going great for Nixon, until it was uncovered that back home he was being a very naughty boy and violating constitutional protocol. I'm announcing today my resignation as president, and I'm passing the office to my vice president, Gerald Ford. Wow, you mean in America that people can actually remove their leader when he breaks the law? Why not just rule by force? Where's the corruption? And my first act as president is to pardon Nixon. There it is. After the whole fiasco, Americans decided what they really wanted was just a nice, safe guy who wouldn't cheat on them. So they elected Jimmy Carter, and the two sides met in Vienna, where they signed yet another strategic arms limitation treaty. It's an honor, Premier Brezhnev. Likewise, President Carter. Please don't do that. But that's not to say there was no longer any tension between the two sides, because there was. Heaps of it. Once again, the Soviet Union put down further attempts at reform and rebellion in the Eastern Bloc. The Euro missile crisis saw new and improved classes of intermediate-range missiles being deployed in Europe. In 1979, the Soviets thought it would be a good idea if they had their own Vietnam and invaded Afghanistan to prevent a US-sponsored Islamic insurgency. And in response to these various crises, Olympic Games were boycotted. Conservatives were concerned that US policy had become too soft, and in 1980, they decided they wanted a president who would be tough on communism, so they elected Ronald Reagan. And Reagan came in guns blazing. Concerned at the Soviet Union's human rights violations, he made a speech calling them an evil empire. And he also wanted to renew the arms race using technological advances in computing and lasers. He came up with the Space Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars, which was basically a big defensive anti-nuke shield around the country. But a lot of people thought it was a pretty dumb idea.
Okay, so that's a lot of things that happened there. So Jimmy Carter as well, kind of an interesting figure in himself, and he was actually a lot of reports to say that the Soviets actually mistrusted him because he seemed too nice, that it seemed dishonest or disingenuine. But obviously you have the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which is aptly put as really the Soviets Vietnam. You know, not only is it the setting for Rambo 3, for any of those of you who enjoy that, but yeah, it was, I mean, Afghanistan's called the graveyard of empires for a reason, and the Soviets had about as much success as anybody else there in their attempted occupation and stuff like that. The US also supported the Mujahideen and various other resistance organizations, supplied them with weapons to counter the Soviets. And again, it ended up with the Soviets having to really kind of cut their losses and deal with things. And then obviously you have Ronald Reagan coming to the fore, who, you know, again still remains to be a controversial figure today, and that only kind of kicked the dog, so to speak, in terms of tensions going out the window. Star Wars, again, an idea that everybody thought was relatively stupid and far too expensive to do, and so it never happened. But the idea of it is essentially there, in that what they wanted to do was build like a kind of satellite type network that would orbit US somehow. I don't know how, and it would essentially intercept any incoming missiles, and so it would make America basically invincible to nuclear strikes. Again, I'm not a scientist. I don't know the kind of legitimacy of that, or even if that's possible. But yeah, it never happened. And yeah, we're certainly getting to some more interesting parts coming up now as well.
The Soviet Union perceived this shift in rhetoric as the USA getting ready for war, and they were feeling especially threatened as their relationship with their communist ally China had broken down. Relations took a big hit in 1983 when the Soviets shot down a Korean airliner that had strayed into their airspace, and it looked like the world was going right back to mid-20th century Cold War tension. But then Brezhnev got really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and was replaced by this guy who was really old and died, and he was replaced by Mikhail Gorbachev. Coming into office in 1985, he was the real game changer.
Yeah, so Gorbachev marked a difference in Soviet kind of foreign policy, and I'm sure we're about to get to those now. But the two ones as well was Glasnost and Perestroika, which is essentially kind of in a kind of era where Ronald Reagan was really kind of ramping up tension. Gorbachev was just like, let's calm down, everyone, and attempted to kind of almost westernize the East. He allowed more things like freedom of thought, freedom of expression, democratic votes in some circumstances, not in all, but it allowed greater kind of personal freedom and essentially political freedom as well, which again, you know, there's arguments for and against that. When you're talking about the longevity of the Soviet Union, because there are large elements that suggest that things like Glasnost and Perestroika were what ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, because, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll see. Got to unmute the sound again. Okay, there we go.
Coming into office in 1985, he was the real game changer. His philosophy differed a lot from previous Soviet leaders. He felt that the reason the Soviet system and economy was struggling was that it didn't allow the Soviet people to find satisfaction in their work, because they weren't allowed to speak freely and lived in fear. Gorbachev wanted the Soviet people to be happy, but unlike previous Soviet leaders, he actually made the change happen. Within the first couple of years, he began the political movement for more openness and transparency, and the restructuring of the Soviet political and economic systems. And change very quickly took effect. People could criticize the government, they could enjoy Western pop culture, the media interviewed Margaret Thatcher, but most importantly, the Soviet people could now enjoy Pizza Hut. All hail to Gorbachev. He also knew that the arms race needed to end in order to rescue the Soviet economy, and a positive relationship with the West must be established. Constructive dialogue reopened and resulted in the INF Treaty, which saw all intermediate-range missiles eliminated, which was huge. Reagan's tone towards the Soviet Union began to soften, and things were looking up. But what would these reforms mean for the Eastern Bloc? For decades, the Soviets had been brutally suppressing any attempt at change. Now, would they be allowed? And that was the exact question on Hungary's lips when the Prime Minister visited Moscow. Gorbachev's response: he didn't necessarily agree with the reforms, but he wouldn't stop them either. He was prepared to let the Eastern Bloc choose its own future. This was massive, and the Hungarian leaders began planning free, multi-party elections. Poland followed suit and also held elections in June. The anti-Soviet party Solidarity won 99 out of 100 seats in the Senate. But not just that. In Hungary, the barbed wire border between East and West was removed. The Iron Curtain was unraveling. But not all Eastern Bloc leaders were happy. Notably, East Germany was still ruled by a hardline Stalinist, Erich Honecker, and many East Germans were still eager to get out. They had been trapped by the Berlin Wall, but now they were doing the math. If they could travel to Hungary, and Hungary's border with the West was loosening, could they now make it to the West? That summer, East Germans decided Hungary was the latest top holiday destination. They traveled there in droves, and using various methods, tens of thousands crossed the border into Austria and the West. Honecker was furious, and blocked travel to Hungary, but that civil liberties train had started rolling, and it wasn't stopping. Thousands more flocked to the West German embassy in Prague, where they stormed the fence around the embassy gardens, and a temporary refugee camp was set up. In September, deals were struck to allow the refugees to travel west via train. Back in East Germany, the people were running on a civil liberties high, and they wanted their next hit. Dissent was growing. Over time, demonstrations turned to mass protest, with plainclothes secret police officers doing their best to put down the dissent, but it had grown well out of their control. And worse, the biggest demonstration was yet to come. We're gonna put all of this down by force. Right, guys? Guys? Unfortunately, everyone had realized what he had not. This was bigger than them, and the entire East German Politburo voted him out of power. On November 4th, over 500,000 East Germans took to the streets of East Berlin. For many, there was still one big target left in their sights: that damn wall. The pressure on the East German government was too great, and on November 9th, they made a bit of a chaotic announcement that the travel ban between East and West was being lifted. The change wasn't meant to take effect until the next day, and crossing guards still had orders to shoot on sight any who tried to cross. But that night, huge crowds gathered at the crossing points, and the guards were overwhelmed. In an astronomically historic moment, after decades of family separation and travel restriction, the people were allowed to pass through. East and West Berliners couldn't believe it and celebrated together throughout the night. Some even climbed the wall and began to topple it. The Iron Curtain had fallen, and a year later, Germany would be reunited. Elections in Bulgaria, a peaceful revolution in Czechoslovakia, and a violent one in Romania brought to an end communist authority in the Eastern Bloc. America decided it would be best if it just stayed away and let the change happen, as the anti-communist movement continued all the way back to Moscow. Gorbachev had given the people the freedom to demonstrate. Now, they demonstrated for an end to the communist single-party rule, and Gorbachev had to give in. For the first time in history, elections were held in which candidates not officially endorsed by the party were allowed to run. Ambitious rival of Gorbachev, Boris Yeltsin, led a growing democratic movement. Now things here get quite confusing, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union is a complicated topic, so believe me, this is oversimplified. But
Okay, so just quickly before we get into that, again, Gorbachev's reforms are really kind of endemic of the Cold War ending. And I think to an extent he deserves some credit for doing so. I mean, obviously this depends on your political opinion and your standpoint, but allowing glasnost and perestroika and free and fair elections, which should have been after the Second World War, happening anyway, in kind of dismantling of the kind of fear and terror around it, is certainly a positive move, in my opinion. However, at the same vein of that, by allowing this kind of run of democracy, this freedom to criticize, to choose and stuff like that, at the same time, he also just made the rope to hang himself with, to use that analogy, is by making elections happen, by allowing criticism and stuff like that. It meant that all of these people's issues and problems with the Soviet Union or communism as a whole or Russian rule over the years suddenly fell upon him, and it's ultimately kind of, well, is what results in what's about to happen, where he kind of gets taken hostage a little bit.
it went a little bit like this. The Soviet Union was made up of a number of smaller Soviet republics, the largest of which was Russia. Yeltsin got himself elected the president of Russia and began a struggle for sovereignty against Gorbachev and the greater Soviet Union. Communist hardliners were horrified at what Gorbachev was allowing, so they briefly kidnapped him and tried to set up their own emergency government. But Yeltsin and his supporters all gathered around the White House in Moscow and were like, no, We have a tank, so the hardliners had to concede and released Gorbachev. Wow, thanks Boris. That was a close one. No problem. And thanks to you for all the great freedom you've given us. Anytime, pal. And just to inform you, I've used that freedom you've given us to go behind your back and make a deal with Ukraine and Belarus to dissolve the Soviet Union and set up the Russian Federation. In other words, you're no longer in charge, I am. Dude. So uncool. And so decades of tension and the everlasting threat of nuclear war finally came to an end as democratic governments were established in many of the old Soviet republics, and the world got along together forever after. Right, guys?
Oh, well, hopefully not. I mean, given the way that 2020 went, please no. Not in 2021, thank you very much. But yeah, so that's the OverSimplified Cold War Part 2 video. Apologies for my rambling about Vietnam halfway through there. Kind of lost my train of thought, but as I said, history is so interesting. All the various different ways that it can go. And it is something that's really fun as well to talk about alternate history and what could have happened and what might have happened if this is different or this is different or what. And of course, there's not really an academic base to that. It's people's opinions, but you know, opinions are still fun. So hopefully, if you've made it this far, thank you again for watching and putting up with my rambling. If you've learned something, then thank you very much. Or if you learned something, thank you very much. If you learned something, I am more than happy. If you have something to add or something that I might have missed or some extra facts that you want to throw in, then please do tell us in the comments. You know, as I said in some of my videos before, I'm by no means an expert. I am a history tutor, I am a historian, but there's always more room to learn. A lot of these videos are just me reacting and stream of consciousness of what comes into my head, in case you haven't noticed. So yeah, I'm always eager to learn more about things that I don't know, or that I might have missed or overlooked, or even got wrong, because we all make mistakes. So yeah, so that leads us to the end of the Cold War videos. And again, similar to what I said in part 1, if you would like me to stick with OverSimplified, then please let me know. Or would you prefer me to branch out to other different kind of videos, whether that be simple history, whether that be, you know, as I said, epic rap battles of history, and then maybe have a look at some of those. Because, I mean, I watched some of them years ago, and now some of them, I assume that they're still going. Would you like me to have a look at some of the more history-based ones and kind of try and give a fact file about these individuals and maybe some of the things that they're referencing? Or, you know, or would you like me to move away from 20th century history and maybe have a look at other things, you know, like ancient or classical or medieval history or things like that? Let me know. But yeah, so without further ado, I thank you ever so much for watching. Please, please, please look after yourself, stay safe, look after your loved ones during this time. You know, bit of difficult time right now. I mean, particularly in my country, in England, the things with the pandemic as well is not particularly great. But if these videos can help distract you a little bit, then I'm more than happy to do that. And so again, please stay safe, look after yourself, look after your loved ones. Thank you ever so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.